Welcome to the first episode of Let's Talk About. This is a podcast where we talk about anything, and this is the first proper episode. The previous episode I did was a pilot episode. You can go and look at that to see what we're about. This episode is called Let's Talk About Arguments. And when I say arguments, I mean the arguments in the sense that you might argue with your other half or your mum and dad, just friends arguing, just having a go at each other. That's the normal sort of personal kind of arguments. But then I also mean arguments like debates. So like you'd have political debates or just debates that people do at school. Like I know some schools do like a debate club. I never had that in my school, but I know that's a big thing in America where you have like a debate club. So I'm also talking about that type of debate arguments as well. So there's the personal arguments, and then the more serious sort of I'm an intellectual type of argument. And the reason why I want to talk about this, and the reason why it interests me, is it's kind of personal, like not in a weird way, just like it's something that I find personally interesting, but also I think it's interesting on a global scale, just as humans, as a species, why we argue and the way we do it and things like that. But for me, I have found talking about things and really asking questions about the world and the way things work and each other, I found that really interesting for the past like 3 or 4 years, especially since I left university. So anything that's kind of like talking to each other about the way the world works and just understanding why someone thinks a certain way, I find that so interesting. And I'm not even doing it necessarily to be smarter. I'm not trying to learn things to be smarter. Maybe that's a byproduct, but mostly I just find it interesting why people think the things that they do. Like, why do people believe in a god? Why do people support a certain political party rather than others? And more like human things, like why do people cheat, both like in relationships and just cheating, like breaking laws, things like that. I really like to talk to people about things like that, and a lot of times that involves like me saying to someone, well, why do you think that? And then they'll come back and say, because of this, this and this and this, and then I say, but that contradicts yourself, that doesn't add up, that's not true. And that happens quite a lot. So for me, talking about these things I've always found it really interesting. And don't get me wrong, like I don't enjoy the sort of shouty arguments when like you're arguing with your parents or your girlfriend about like who did the fucking dishes and you didn't do them right and shit like that. I don't enjoy that. That's just a normal argument. But that's sort of why I find this subject interesting, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail on that later. But I think arguing, it goes beyond just something that I'm interested in. It's something that I personally think that it's incredibly important to get right. It has importance in the world, and it's important for people to constructively argue about certain things in order to figure out the way we're going to run the world, figure out the way we're going to interact with each other, and how we are going to come to the best world we possibly can. And what I'm going to talk about in this podcast, this episode, is how we're really, 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 really shit at that. We're really fucking shit at arguing about things. And again, I don't mean like the shouty, aggressive part of it. I mean literally debating. Like, we're always going to be shit at the emotional outburst kind of argument. That's just our emotions come into that, and we're just upset because someone called us a knob and that upset us, and there's no logic behind that. You're just getting pissed off at each other. So that's, I find it interesting, the things people say and the way people react, but that's more of a personal interest. That's never going to change. But the way we argue in actual debates in the real world, in political debates, in court, in things that actually matter in shaping the world, that's really important, and we need to do that right, and we need to make sure we've all got the same goals and there's no personal agenda or hidden biases or anything like that. So why do we argue? So a lot of people are under the misapprehension that we argue with the intention of proving who's right. And by misapprehension, I don't mean to say that in that you're stupid for believing that that's why we argue, because that's what everyone believes we argue to do. The point of an argument is to hash out who's right and wrong. But when you actually really watch arguments or listen to arguments and kind of act as almost like a third person, as though you're looking through, when they do like police interviews and they have the one-way glass. Like, if you imagine you're someone on the other side of that one-way glass and you're just watching two people argue and you have no interest in who wins or not, you're just trying to objectively figure out who's right or wrong, you'll start to realise that they aren't trying to come to the conclusion of what's right or wrong. They are trying to make themselves appear as though they are right. And that's a really important distinction. So if I was genuinely trying to come to the correct answer of something, of a question, if I really wanted to make sure I had the real right position, not just the one I believed was right, but the in reality factual right answer, then I'm not trying to leave the argument winning. I'm trying to leave the argument having the correct answer. So me winning the argument has no bearing on the success of that. So I'm going to repeat that because that's the first time I talked about this. Either I explain it really bad or it's just a confusing subject. So let's say I believe in aliens and I'm arguing with another guy who doesn't believe in aliens. He's trying to convince me that aliens aren't real and I'm trying to convince him aliens are real. So if I'm going into that conversation with the goal of being right, like actually being in reality correct, then if he shows me evidence and shows me proofs that I can't refute and say are incorrect, and prove that are incorrect, then in order for me to leave that conversation being right, I have to abandon my position and then agree with him. Because if I ignore his evidence and then continue believing what I believe, I may think I'm right, or I may leave the conversation believing that I'm right, but in actuality I am wrong. So the only way I can do that is by admitting during that conversation, okay, yeah, you got me, I seem to have fucked up a bit there, and you seem to be right, I seem to be wrong. So that's the way it should go if we argue in order to be right. That's the way the arguments would go. Everyone would do that if that's what, if arguing was to make sure that we were all correct about what we were arguing about. But what actually happens in reality is that people don't drop their belief, even in the face of evidence against their belief. So what might happen in that situation that I just gave you, that example, is I'm the one saying aliens do exist, and the other guy's saying they don't. And what's more likely to happen in the real world with the majority of people is that he's going to show me that evidence, and then I'm going to say, yeah, but that's not good evidence, or yeah, but like I saw this and like what I saw is evidence as well. And it doesn't matter how much evidence he gives me, I will not change my position during that argument, or at least it's very, very, very unlikely that I will change my position in that argument. Maybe if he came up with some evidence that was so compelling that I would just be a complete... Well, I was going to say that I would be a complete idiot for not believing it, but people still do that. Someone would show video of someone like committing a crime, and then the person would say like, no, that can't be right, that must be wrong. And you see that in America right now with Donald Trump. I laugh because it's unbelievable, like the stuff that he gets away with. He will lie within the same sentence. He will contradict himself in the same sentence. So he will say one thing and then 15 seconds later say the exact opposite, and then his fans will not think that he's a liar. So, and in that scenario, because he's contradicting himself, it doesn't matter which one is true. So he said two things. It doesn't matter which one is the truth because he contradicts himself. So it doesn't matter whether it's fake news or not. He lied, and you can show them that video and they just won't believe it. So people, to varying degrees, will jump through all sorts of hoops to believe that they are right. And in the alien example, I might, if I was that kind of person, I might leave that conversation ignoring all that evidence and still come out just thinking, oh, well, he's an idiot, what does he know? Like, he hasn't seen what I've seen. And in the way that we think we are meant to argue, I have failed because I've left that argument being incorrect, because I am factually incorrect. But in the way that we actually argue, which is to feel correct, so the way we actually argue is that we just want to leave an argument appearing and feeling like we're correct. I've won, because all I want to do is convince the other person that I'm right, convince anyone who's listening that I'm right, and convince myself that I'm right. The actual reality of whether I'm right or not doesn't matter. And this is something that you can actually kind of see and test for yourself. I mean, think about every time you've had an argument with someone about something, not like personal, not like, oh, you fucking didn't do the dishes, you're not bad, like, not that kind of arguments, like the kind of arguments where in the UK at the moment we have Brexit and people are arguing about that constantly. Say you are pro-life versus pro-choice, maybe you're arguing about that, maybe you're arguing about gun rights in America. When was the last time you ever argued with someone or seen someone argue where the other person during the argument went, oh yeah, maybe you're right about that, maybe I should rethink that? Have a think about it. I've never seen it. I have, maybe never's a strong word, but definitely less than 5 times. Like maybe twice, maybe 3 times I've ever seen that. And not counting myself, because like I have been in every argument I've ever had, so I'd be a little bit biased to count me in that. But I think I've done that a few times, hopefully. Like I'm definitely just as guilty as anyone else in doing that. Like I'm just as human as well, and I definitely do that quite a lot as well. But I hope that I manage to admit when I'm wrong. So if you try that and try and see if you can remember an argument where someone's admitted that they were wrong during the argument, you'll realise that it's incredibly rare. It almost never happens. So that means that either almost no one has ever given an actual well thought out argument during a debate, so no one could ever be convinced, or the alternative is that people aren't there willing to be convinced. The participants of that argument or the audience or anything like that aren't willing to be convinced. And as far as I can tell, it's far more likely to be the latter. And what I'm going to do, actually, I'm going to do some Googling and try and see if there's actually some science on this. Right, so what shall I Google? Why don't people like to admit they are wrong in arguments? So I've done some Googling and found some articles and shit. First thing I found was an article on a website called Executive Style. Never heard of it, but that article was very small and relatively unimportant, but it did link to a study that was done in 2001, which was a lot more interesting. The study's called Clinging to Beliefs, a Constraint Satisfaction a constraint satisfaction model. And what the study says is they tested some people by giving them suicide notes for some reason. Don't know why the fuck they chose suicide notes, but they gave them fake suicide notes and then told them to evaluate whether they were real or not. And after they had done that, the experimenters, whatever you call them, scientists, professors, I don't know, they gave them fake results. So whether they did good or bad in evaluating the suicide notes, the assessors said just gave them random results, good or bad, really good, really bad, whatever. And then what they did after that is they gave them the results, gave them time to think, and then afterwards they split the group into three different sections, and they either didn't tell them anything about the experiment. That's group 1. Group 2, they told them about the fact that they'd completely made up the results. And then group 3, they told that they'd made up the results, and they told them exactly about the experiment, like what they were doing, that they were actually evaluating how likely they are to admit they're wrong and things like that. And what they found by doing this was that the people that they didn't tell anything to, they carried on believing that they were either right or wrong. And that kind of makes sense. If you've been told that you've done good by a scientist, you're probably just going to carry on thinking that you're doing good. I would anyway if I was in that situation, especially if I didn't know what they were testing, and the subjects, the people involved, didn't at this point. But the second group, called the outcome debriefing group, the one that they were told that the results were wrong, they were just fake, they still believed that they were either right or wrong. So if they were told they did really good in their results, even when they were told afterwards, no, we completely made up that result, you didn't do really well, you did worse than that actually, they still carried on believing that they had done better than they actually did. And it worked in the opposite as well. So the people who'd been told that they did really bad, even when they told, no, you actually did better than that, we completely made up that result, they still believed that they had done worse than they actually did. So that belief, even in the face of them it being explicitly, the scientists explicitly saying, no, we completely made this up, we did this experiment and we made up that result, they still believed the incorrect results. And it was only at the point where, in the third group, where they said, no, we completely made up the results and we are doing this as a specific scientific experiment to test whether you're able to admit that you're wrong or not. It was only then that people started to get close to their actual scores. And in that, you can kind of see why that would happen, to be honest, because have you ever had an argument or talked with someone and you've tricked them into believing something or something along them lines, and then when you've told them that you've tricked them, they say something along the lines of like, oh yeah, well, I knew that all along, I was just messing with you, or something like that. They try and make out as they knew all along, they try and justify, like, no, that's what I meant really, that kind of thing. That's kind of what seemed to have happened in that third group, that when they've been told, we did this with the intention of making you appear stupid, essentially. Not actually stupid, like unintelligent, but that's the way a normal person will perceive it. We did this intentionally to make you seem incorrect. That person is going to go into, no, I have to be right mode, and they're suddenly going to change their position. And like I said, you see this in arguments where you trick people. Suddenly they change as soon as they know that they're being tricked, they change their mind and they say, no, I knew that all along. So it's kind of almost like a defense mechanism. It's like their way of saying, no, even though I was wrong, I was right, really. I encourage you to actually look at the study, because it's 6 pages long. It's really not that big. And the bit that I read, I only read 2 pages of it, because the rest is more really scientific stuff. But go look it up, because it's kind of interesting. But that kind of proves what I was well, not proves, but it doesn't prove it, but it provides evidence for what I was saying, which is that people don't argue to be correct. They argue to feel like they are correct. Oh, and another thing this article said, this study, which I've never thought about it this way explicitly, but I thought it was quite interesting, is it says the reason why this might happen is because when people are told that they did well on the experiment, they justified that in their own head with some kind of personal experience. So the person that did well might say, oh, I did really well because I'm really good at noticing when people are depressed, because it was a suicide note. I'm just really in touch with my feelings and I know that kind of stuff. They might create that story in their own head, and the person who did badly might say, I did really badly because I'm not very good at recognising them things. Maybe I don't have as much experience with people with depression. And once they've got that story in their head, when they're told the reality, that story is still there, and it kind of acts as almost like an inoculation to the truth. So before, you were a completely blank slate. You had no opinions on whether you were good at determining the validity of a suicide note or not. But once you're told you're either good or bad at it, you have that story, and you're no longer a blank slate. You have kind of some experience, I guess, and it doesn't matter whether it's correct or not, but the experience is still there. So when the person comes along the second time and tells you, no, your experience is incorrect, you're not a blank slate anymore. It's harder to change that experience. And the study doesn't go into exactly why we find it difficult to change our minds on these things, but I would imagine it's somewhat biological or sociological. So, for example, it could be difficult to change your mind because if you change your mind about a certain thing that you've held a belief of for several years, you might have developed certain behaviours based off of that. So you might live your life a certain way because of that belief. And finding out that you're incorrect about that belief means that the way you've been acting, or potentially acting, over the past year or two was wrong, was incorrect. Imagine, for example, that you spent the first 20 years of your life believing in a God, and because of this belief you've acted in a certain way. You've spent the first 20 years of your life thinking that gays were an abomination, that in some ways women were inferior, that we all deserve to be punished, and people who lie or commit adultery or say God's name in vain, things like that, they deserve to go to hell. So you have all these opinions, and then not only do you have these opinions about other people, you've spent your life in a certain way. So every Sunday you went to church, a portion of your life has been taken over by this belief. So imagine you go to uni or something similar, someplace where you learn, you move to a different city, anything like that, and you're subjected to a whole host of new opinions and evidences and things that you've not heard before, and you start to question yourself. Some people may find it incredibly difficult to come to terms with the fact that the way they've been acting for the past 20 years, a quarter of their life, is based on what they're now realising isn't true. Because imagine that if you found out that you've been hating gays all your life, and now you've just started to realise that all of that hate wasn't justified, and you've been saying horrible things about them, making them feel terrible. It can be hard to admit that you've been this person for all that time. So a lot of time, people don't. Maybe they will over many years, so with lots of self-reflection and all that kind of stuff. But in the heat of the moment, it's very unlikely that that person is going to come to terms with all of that 20 years of being wrong and everything they've gone through over them 20 years within the space of 30 seconds at the end of an argument. And this isn't really a criticism. It's more of an acknowledgement that we don't really argue flawlessly with impeccable logic and anything like that. Mostly we just argue from emotion. And that's human in a lot of ways. Most of the things we do are based off the way we've evolved over like 200,000 years, when it wasn't important to be methodical and really precise about things, because a lot of the time it was fight or flight. You just had to decide quickly in the moment, and logic isn't quick a lot of the time. Logic requires a lot of time to really sink in. And like what I just said with that example, within that first 30 seconds of sort of internally, subconsciously realising that you're wrong, your emotions kick in, and your first reaction is just quick, gut response of, no, that can't be right. Then over a couple of weeks, couple of months, couple of years, you actually start to think things through, and logic eventually changes your perception of things. And I think arguably there's another reason for why we're so unable to admit when we might be wrong. And I think that's because we want to sound as intelligent as possible, or at least what we think sounds intelligent. Because intelligence has become almost like a social cue for dominance. So to sort of clarify that a bit, what I mean is 100 years ago, when you think about the main type of working class job, it's a labourer, so someone who does hard work, like physically hard work. So in the mines, sweeping chimneys, that kind of stuff. And even later than that, even in the 50s, 60s, 70s, you were still doing hard labour jobs. So you were working on factories where you were working with your hands all day. So there is an example of where physical strength is important if you want to have a living. If you want to be able to provide for your family, for whoever you care about, if you want to have a life, you have to be physically fit, or at least to a certain level to be able to have any sort of standing. And then not only that, if you look about what was happening 100 years ago, there was a lot more wars where the majority of the force was people. So if you compare that to now, so nowadays, a lot of the fighting is done with either cyber warfare, so hacking and things like that, or a lot of fighting is done with drones and more precise technology. And then even the ones where they send in the like physical actual people, it's usually smaller forces. So if you think about like storming the Normandy beaches, that was just thousands of men. Whereas now, even when it's actually men going in and fighting, it's not like tens of thousands of men all rushing in. It's usually small forces of like max 100. Obviously, I'm talking about developed countries now. This still may not be true of the less developed countries where there's wars going on. So because of this, you've got two sort of pressures on an individual to be physically fit, strong. So you need to be physically fit and able to provide a living for your family, but then you also need to be that to provide service to your country in the form of going to war. And because of this, you found that the kind of traits that would be considered desirable in terms of both in a romantic way and just a personal friendship type of way would be things like hardworking, loyal, courageous, patriotic, athletic, as in like physically fit. So you found these sort of traits mirrored in everyday life. So movies would idolise like sort of muscly, courageous sort of men. So any sort of movie about war would be it would always be painted in a really positive light, like the people going to war were like heroes. And of course it wouldn't show the bloody, terrible side of war, but that's another story. And also it would be mirrored in the workplace as well, so becoming ill, having any days off ill, was considered a form of weakness. Working long hours, that was considered a strength. And what this led to was a kind of social structure where dominance in terms of like you know how you have a wolf pack, and then you have the alpha leader, and then I guess you call them the betas, I guess. So you have like a natural progression of who's the leaders and who's the followers. You still have that in humans, and the way that the leaders and the dominant ones were decided was through this system of who was the hard workers, who didn't get sick, and because at the end of the day, those who had them traits was able to provide for their family in terms of physical food and for their community, as in country, even though that's a larger community, it's still a community. And that goes back to like biological roots. When you were a caveman, your job was to raise your kid, so you pass on your genes. That's the evolutionary side of things. But then because we're humans and we're communal animals, in order to do that, in order to be able to raise our kids as efficiently as possible, we have to make sure our community is safe. So this biological trait of looking after our family, our kids, and looking after our community goes all the way back to caveman times. And we still see remnants of it now, where the traits that mean we can look after our community and our family are traits that are seen as desirable. So the people with more of those traits are the more dominant ones in society. And especially when you think about it in terms of who would be considered like a good family man, for lack of a better word. If there was a man with a good steady paying job that they were likely to keep because they were fit and healthy and really had days off, and they were good at their job, they worked long hours and did well, then they are a good provider for their family in terms of actual food and shelter and things like that. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because for a long time this has been true. The fact that strength and physical well-being is like the dominance cue, the main dominance cue for, especially for males, that's been true for a long time. But what's happened now is, as jobs have become less physical because of automation and technology, and a lot of jobs have turned into office jobs and things where you sit at a computer and most of your work is mental work, the main signal for dominance has switched from these strength type traits to more mental type traits. So things like intelligence, education, things like that. And it's still for all the same reasons. The reasons being that we need to provide for our families, our children, and we also need to provide for our community. The thing that's different is that we used to do that through hard physical work, labour, and now we do it through hard mental work. And you can see this change everywhere, because I remember even when I was growing up, and I'm not that old, I'm only 27, and I remember growing up in school where if you tried to be clever, if you worked hard, you got bullied for it. If you wanted to learn things, you got bullied. And even things like if you were into computers, if you were into science, you're a nerd. Back then, nerd was a bad thing, whereas now it's more of a... It's not great, like you're not considered amazing, but it's definitely not a negative thing anymore. But you also see the younger generation that's still moulding their minds to the current times. They're way, way more receptive to things that we would have previously considered not important. So like the younger generation cares more about politics, they care more about science and like global issues. They want to do better in school, they care about going to uni and college. And one of the things I've noticed in the past year or so that makes me think that I'm definitely right in this is that, you know how people used to say, if you have an argument with someone, if you have a disagreement with someone, they used to say, oh, let's go outside, and they'll be talking about having a fight. And the reason for that was because they were still in the old model of dominance, which was physical strength is social dominance. Whereas now, people don't say, let's go outside and have a fight, they say, let's debate, which is mental to me, Because can you imagine that in the wild? Because what we're talking about is two people trying to show social dominance over one another in a very sort of primal way. And rather than saying, let's fight like animals would do, so gorillas and hippos and giraffes and things like that, rather than fighting physically, they don't fight, they say, let's debate. Which, see, if you can think about how things used to be, for me that's crazy. The idea of like two muscly blokes having an argument, and then just as you think they're about to throw a punch, they go and sit down at like a chessboard or something. I'm not saying that actually happens, but the idea of that is kind of where we're going. And this is something you see on Twitter constantly, and YouTube and all the social media platforms. You see people, when they have a disagreement about something, about politics or religion or anything that will make people angry because they're disagreeing about very volatile subjects, they don't say let's fight, they say let's debate. So intelligence has become the new social currency. Before it used to be strength, now it's intelligence. So with all that context that I've just told you over the last 20 minutes, because of this, people want to sound smart during arguments. People want to sound intelligent because sounding intelligent makes you appear more socially dominant in this day and age. And notice I said sound intelligent, not be intelligent, because you don't actually need to be intelligent in order for people to think you are. You just need to sound like you are, give the impression that you're intelligent. And this isn't unique to intelligent, this is also true of strength as well, the old way of doing things. For example, you didn't actually have to go to war to get all the praise of someone actually going to war. All you need to be doing is wearing the uniform, and it's almost like a cue, like a signal that, oh, I'm courageous, look at me. And then you don't actually have to do anything courageous, you just have to give off the signal to other people that you appear to be courageous, and then people respond because of that. And it's the same with intelligence as things are done now. And what are the signals for being intelligent? It's somewhat obvious, really, and kind of silly at the same time. So things like reading lots of books, using big words, saying things like, oh, I'll debate you. These are all things that make someone who's not really paying attention go, oh, they seem like a smart person. And this leads to people who, in a lot of cases, make a living off of just sounding smart. All they want to do is sound as smart as possible without caring if their point is right or not. And unfortunately, this works really well, because the majority of the people listening just want their own biases confirmed, because, as I said before, most people just want to know that they're right. They just want to believe they're right, and they don't really want to think about it more deeply than that. And that's easy. That's really easy. You can do that in really small sound bites. You can do that in a 5-minute video on YouTube, because anyone can agree with themselves. If someone else is saying the exact same opinion as you, you just nod your head and say yes, yes, yes. So because you don't spend a lot of time really getting to the specifics of what they've said and unravelling exactly where they might be right or wrong, because you're just agreeing with them because that's what you want, you don't really see that what they're saying isn't correct. It just sounds like it's intelligent. So what do you do when people all over the world are constantly arguing about the correct way to do things, who's right about this, who's wrong about this? What do you do when the majority of them aren't arguing to come to the correct answer? They're doing it for emotional reasons, or because they want to appear socially dominant, or because they're uncomfortable with the idea of being wrong. How do you really have a useful argument? And in my opinion, the answer is you can't. In 99% of circumstances, it's very, very, very difficult to actually have a productive argument which solves something. And there are occasions where I'll be proven wrong on that, and that's the exception though. But there are things that people can do to make things a bit easier. So when you do have an argument with someone and they seem like this type of person who wants to sound smart and isn't really saying anything useful, or they just seem completely unwilling to change their position despite the fact that you're giving countless amounts of evidence. And I've got 3 main points that have worked for me really well, and I've found that as I've done these more, I've had less arguments, but also in the arguments that I do have, they usually come out better, mostly for me because I'm less I get less annoyed by them when they don't go my way. But also sometimes I occasionally manage to convince other people, and also convince myself as well that I might be wrong. But that still is rare, but more often than previously when I was a teenager and didn't know what I was doing. So 3 points. First one, in my opinion, is one of the most important ones. Ask questions. So I find that when people have arguments, the majority of the time, people just talk at each other. So person 1 just says, I believe this, I believe this, I believe this, you're wrong about this, you're wrong about this. And then the other person responds, well, I believe this, and I believe this, and you're wrong about that, that, and that. And in my opinion, it's so much easier if when person says, I believe this, and I believe this, you just say, okay, so that first thing you said, why do you believe that? And just keep it as simple as that. And then every time they give a response, try and find a question that you can ask them about their response. So if they say, well, I believe that because I think it's more productive. I don't know what the thing is, but let's just say it's that. Then you say, okay, so why do you think it's more productive? And eventually they should get to the point where they can give you evidence. And if they don't get to that point, you can just say, well, everything you just said was just something you believe then. And by doing this, you can isolate their single belief and try and figure that out, rather than them telling you their belief and then you telling them your belief without actually talking about it. And that's what usually happens. That's what happens on Twitter and even like professional debates. Just people sort of shout at each other, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. This is what I think. You're wrong, you're wrong. It just goes round in circles, and no one changes their mind when they do it that way. Whereas if you ask questions, people love to talk about themselves. So if you just ask questions, they'll talk and talk and talk, and they won't care. So that's advice number 1. Advice number 2 is, if you realise you're wrong as someone's talking, even if it's on a subconscious level, just stop and think, and then just think, right, have I thought this through? And then if you think you might be wrong, admit that straight up. Like, don't be embarrassed to admit it. And I think over the next 10, 20 years, this will be a trend. Like, as we've seen intelligence become a new sort of social norm and trending in the direction of being a social dominance cue, we'll see that admitting you're wrong becomes a sign of social dominance as well. And that's all under the umbrella of mental ability. So it's under the same umbrella that intelligence comes under, but it'll be a new thing that in the next 5-10 years or so, we'll start to see that being increasingly a good thing. So if someone says something and then you don't know how to answer it, just stop for a second, think for 5 seconds, and then if you can't think of a good response, just say I don't know. And the more you do that, this was true for me at least, the more I did that, the more comfortable I got with the idea of not knowing. And now I can do it really easily, like in a conversation. I think I did it literally 2 or 3 days ago, where someone was talking about, that was it. So we were talking about mental health and stuff, and I said, I can't imagine someone having, I can't remember which disorder it was, but it was some kind of disorder where they said, I think it might have been bipolar. I can't imagine having bipolar where you can be both happy and sad at the same time. And then this guy said, like straight away, he said like, well, what about a funeral? You're happy for the memory of that person, but you're also sad that they're gone. And that made me think, and I literally just stopped and I was like, oh yeah, okay, fair enough. I didn't say I was wrong, I didn't say he was right, I just sort of went, oh yeah, I never thought about it like that. And then that was it. And it wasn't embarrassing or anything like that. So the more we admit that we're wrong, the more we get used to that, the easier it is. And finally, the last point. This links back to the other thing I was saying about people being reluctant to change their opinion on something because they have like an emotional tie to it. When someone's sort of subconsciously realising that they're wrong, they're never going to figure this out straight away during the argument. Sometimes people just need some time to go away and think about things, to really mull things over, maybe talk to you again, maybe talk to some other people again. So when you have an argument with someone, if they seem like they're being the kind of person who's just unwilling to listen, just let it go. Just end the conversation, let them go away and think about things. And you obviously be polite and things like that, but just let them go away. And if they want to talk about it again, let them talk about it again. And you'll find that over time, and it might take a long time, but over time, they might come around to your way of thinking. Especially if they've grown up for the first 20, 30 years of their life not hearing any other opinion. You're not going to get rid of 30 years of thought within 2 conversations. It might take several, or months, or even years to really change that viewpoint if it's really emotionally invested in them. So that last point is just be patient with them. So that was my first episode of Let's Talk About arguments, and I kind of enjoyed it. It's really, I still find it really, really weird talking to no one, apart from Jerry, obviously. And if you don't understand that, go look at the pilot, and that'll explain why I'm saying Jerry. But yeah, I still find it weird talking to no one, but I'll get more used to it, and I'll get more used to talking better, etc. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I think the next one I'm going to do, originally when I was deciding on what to do this one, it was between this one and democracy, and this one won out just because it was what I was thinking about at the time. But next one I'm going to do democracy because of what's going on in England right now with Brexit and the idea of democracy. I have a lot of opinions on it right now. So next week I'll try and do Let's Talk About Democracy, and I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you soon.